Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. A lone figure stood atop the weathered ridge, silhouetted against the dying light of day. His fur-lined cloak fluttered in the biting wind as he surveyed the vast expanse before him. Below, nestled in a sheltered valley, lay Ravenshold, a collection of timber structures and stone foundations that could scarcely be called a town. Smoke curled from chimney holes, rising to meet the ominous gray clouds that promised the season's first significant snowfall. Torben Wolfson adjusted the bow slung across his back and pulled his hood tighter. The wind carried whispers of winter's approach, a familiar harbinger of the brutal months to come. For 23 winters, he had survived the borderlands, this untamed wilderness between the faltering grasp of the Old Kingdom and the territories claimed by no man. Some called it the Marchlands. Others, more apt to romanticize their hardship, named it the Wild March. But to those who eked out their existence in these forgotten stretches, it was simply home. "It comes early this year," said a voice behind him. Torben didn't turn. He recognized Elsa's footsteps, quiet though they were. "Aye, the birds flew south before the harvest moon. The elk have descended from the high country already." His weathered face creased with concern. "We've 2 weeks, maybe less, before the deep snows arrive." Elsa, her own cloak pulled tight around her sturdy frame, nodded grimly. "The council gathers tonight. Osgar says the grain stores are 20 measures short of last winter. And last winter took 7 of our own," Torben replied, finally turning to meet her gaze. His eyes, gray as the storm clouds gathering overhead, reflected a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. "We cannot afford another lean season." "Then we'd best get back," Elsa said, gesturing toward the settlement below. "There are plans to be made, preparations to complete." As they descended the ridge, the first snowflakes began to fall, delicate crystalline harbingers of the merciless season to come. Neither spoke of the dread that settled in their hearts. They had both seen enough winters in the borderlands to know what approached. A battle against hunger, cold, and the darkness that crept into men's souls during the long nights ahead. In Ravenshold and scattered settlements, like it across the forgotten frontiers of the old world, people were gathering, preparing, and steeling themselves for the great trial that winter always brought. Some would survive, emerging with the spring thaw, hardened and more resilient. Others would join the countless souls claimed by the borderlands, their bodies committed to the frozen earth, their names remembered only in the whispered stories told around winter fires. This is their tale, a chronicle of survival on civilization's edge, where medieval order collapsed into frontier chaos, and where only the strongest, wisest, or most fortunate would live to see another spring. The great hall of Ravenshold was hardly impressive by the standards of the Old Kingdom. No tapestries adorned its rough-hewn walls, no elaborate carvings decorated its support beams. Yet to the 60-some souls gathered within its confines, it represented the heart of their community, a bastion against the encroaching wilderness and the bitter cold of the borderland winter. Torben took his place at the council table, a massive slab of oak that had once served as the door to the hall before a raid by marauders from the northern steppes had reduced it to splinters. Repurposed like everything in Ravenshold, it now bore the scars and stains of countless meetings, wheels, and blood oaths. Osgar, the settlement's steward, stood at the head of the table. Despite his 60 winters, his back remained straight, his voice commanding. The former royal tax collector had found himself stranded in the borderlands when the kingdom's reach receded like a tide. leaving remote outposts to fend for themselves. His knowledge of record-keeping and resource management had proven invaluable. "The count is complete," Oscar announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the assembled. "Our grain stores stand at 138 measures. Last winter required 158. A discontented rumble passed through the gathering. "The spring flooding took half the eastern fields," offered Hedda, a stout woman who oversaw the communal planting. "And the summer drought withered much of what remained. We were fortunate to harvest what we did." "Fortune will not fill empty bellies," grumbled Carl Ironhand, the settlement smith. His massive arms were crossed over his chest, his brow furrowed beneath a shock of graying hair. "Nor will it keep the wolves, both four-legged and two-legged, from our doors when desperation sets in." Torben cleared his throat, drawing all eyes. Though he held no official title, his counsel carried weight. 20 years as a ranger patrolling the borderlands had taught him to read not just tracks in the wilderness, but the patterns of survival and destruction that defined life on the edge. "The grain shortage is but one concern," he said, his voice steady. "The signs point to an early and harsh winter. Game has already grown scarce in the near forests. The streams will freeze earlier than usual, and the Nordmen have been spotted ranging farther south than in seasons past." Elsa, who sat beside him, nodded in agreement. 3 hunting parties from the northern settlements failed to return last month. The survivors who strangled in spoke of warriors on horseback, not the usual raiders but organized bands. This news sent another wave of unease through the hall. The Nordmen were a nomadic people from beyond the great northern wastes. Unlike the kingdom's forces, which had withdrawn decades ago, or even the usual bandits who plagued the trade routes, the Nordmen were a different sort of threat, unpredictable, fierce, and utterly without mercy. "Then we face threats from within and without," said Oscar, his expression grave. "Hunger and cold on one hand, steel and fire on the other." "We've weathered such seasons before," said an elderly woman named Matilda, her voice creaking like old leather. "My grandmother told of the winter of wolves, when nothing grew for 2 full seasons, and the desperate came down from the high passes seeking food or death." "And how many survived that winter?" asked Carl darkly. "Enough to tell the tale," Matilda replied with a thin smile. "Enough to rebuild. Enough to remember the ways that kept them alive when all seemed lost." Torben nodded. "Matilda speaks wisely. We must recall the old ways, the methods our ancestors used before the kingdom brought its comforts and dependencies." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each council member. "We must become as our forebears were, self-sufficient, resourceful, and unified in purpose." "What do you propose?" asked Oscar. "We divide our efforts," Torben replied. "Some must secure more provisions. Hunting parties sent to the deep forests beyond our usual range, perhaps as far as the western lakes. Others must strengthen our defenses against both the elements and potential raiders. Still others must preserve what we have, ensuring nothing is wasted." "And if the Nordmen come in force?" Carl questioned. "We've but 25 with any skill at arms, and half of those are barely more than children." "Then we must make 30 seem like 100, Torben said grimly. "Fear and deception can multiply our numbers in the eyes of our enemies. We've the advantage of knowing these lands." As the council debated strategies and assigned responsibilities, a young boy slipped into the hall, his face flushed from the cold outside. He made his way to Elsa's side and whispered urgently in her ear. Her expression darkened as she listened. "What is it?" Torben asked, noting the change. Elsa rose to her feet, her voice cutting through the discussions. "Riders approach from the south, not merchants. They bear arms and travel swiftly." The hall fell silent. "How many?" Oscar demanded. 6, perhaps 7, the boy replied. Hrefna spotted them from the south ridge. They fly no banner, but they wear fragments of armor, mismatched pieces like scavengers. Deserters, Torben concluded. Former soldiers of the kingdom, most likely. The withdrawal of royal forces has left many without purpose or pay. Or brigands who've killed such men and taken their gear, added Carl grimly. Oscar turned to the gathered council. The meeting is concluded for now. Carl, assemble the militia. Torben, assess these newcomers. Determine if they bring threat or opportunity. As the hall emptied, people hurrying to their assigned tasks, Torben caught Elsa's arm. Keep the boy close. I want to know more about what Hrefna saw. Elsa nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. Do you think they're scouts? Advance riders for a larger force? I think, Torben said carefully, that desperate men arrive on our doorstep just as winter closes in. Whether they come as wolves or as potential allies remains to be seen. Outside, the snow fell more heavily now, beginning to blanket Ravenshold in white. Torben pulled his cloak tight and moved toward the settlement's southern approach, his mind calculating possibilities. Winter had not yet fully descended, but already it was forcing the first of many choices upon them. Choices that would determine who would greet the spring and who would be commemorated in the songs of remembrance sung around fires in the dark months ahead. The 6 riders approached Ravenshold's southern gate with the wary posture of men who expected arrows at any moment. Their horses were lean but strong, mountain stock bred for endurance rather than speed. As Torben had suspected, their armor was a hodgepodge of pieces, a breastplate bearing the faded insignia of the royal guard here, a helm that might have belonged to a mercenary company there. Torben stood at the center of the crude gate, flanked by Carl and 4 other militiamen. Behind them, positioned strategically atop the settlement's defensive wall of sharpened logs, archers nocked arrows and waited for a command. That's close enough, Torben called out when the riders were within earshot but beyond the effective range of a sudden charge. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, raised an empty hand in greeting. We come seeking shelter and fair trade, not trouble. His accent marked him as from the eastern provinces of the Old Kingdom, a borderland himself, though from a different frontier. Travelers are rare this close to winter, Torben observed, especially armed men with no merchant goods visible. The scarred man smiled without humor. The roads grow dangerous in all seasons now. The kingdom's retreat has emboldened many who once lurked in shadows. And what does that make you? Carl called out, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Men who lurk in daylight instead? It makes us survivors, replied the rider. Like yourselves, my name is Aldrich, formerly captain of the Eastern March Border Patrol. These are my men, or what remains of them. Torben studied the group more carefully. Despite their ragged appearance, they held themselves with the discipline of trained soldiers. Their weapons were well maintained, if worn, and their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the mark of men accustomed to danger. Your patrol was disbanded? Torben inquired. Aldrich's jaw tightened. Abandoned would be more accurate. The kingdom withdrew its support months ago. No pay, no supplies, not even formal orders releasing us from duty. Simply silence. This matched reports Torben had heard from travelers over the past year. The Old Kingdom, beset by internal strife and dwindling resources, had been gradually contracting its borders, withdrawing troops and officials from its outlying territories. Ravenshold had experienced this abandonment decades earlier. It seemed the process continued elsewhere. And now you ride the borderlands, Torben said. To what end? Survival, as I said, Aldrich replied. We offer our swords to communities that can use them. protection in exchange for shelter and provisions. A fair arrangement in these uncertain times. Carl snorted, protection? Or extortion dressed in noble words? Aldrich's men tensed, but their captain remained calm. We've shed blood defending settlements smaller than yours from threats you've yet to imagine. The borderlands are changing. The vacuum left by the kingdom's retreat is being filled by forces far less civilized. The Nordmen, Torben stated rather than asked. Aldrich's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing Torben. Yes, and others. The forest tribes grow bolder. Bandits organize into small armies, and rumors speak of stranger threats from the far wastes, things not seen since the dark times. Elsa had approached silently during this exchange, and now stood at Torben's shoulder. What do you know of the Nordman movements? She asked directly. They gather under a new leader, Aldrich replied after a moment's hesitation. A man they call the Ice Wolf. He's uniting clans that have warred with each other for generations. Their raids are no longer merely for supplies or slaves. They seek territory. Permanent conquest. A murmur ran through the gathered defenders of Ravenshold. If true, this news changed the nature of the threat they faced. Oscar pushed forward through the crowd. This council will need to discuss your offer, he said formally. Until then, you may camp beyond the eastern fields. You'll be provided with firewood and water, but your weapons remain with you, and you do not enter the settlement proper without escort. Aldrich inclined his head in acceptance. Fair terms. We'll await your decision. He turned his horse, then paused. But I advise you not to deliberate over long. The first storm is upon you, and when the deep snow comes, choices become far more limited. As the riders moved toward the designated area, Torben, Elsa, and the council members withdrew to confer. Mercenaries, Carl spat once they were out of earshot. Sellswords looking for easy winter quarters. Perhaps, Torben allowed. But their information about the Nordmen matches what our own scouts have reported, and 6 experienced fighters could make a difference if we're raided. Or they could slit our throats in our sleep and take what they want, countered Carl. Oscar rubbed his chin thoughtfully. What would be the cost of their service? We're already short on supplies. That's what concerns me, said Elsa. If they learn of our grain shortage, they may decide we're not worth protecting, or worse, that we're easy prey. We need to know more about them, Torben decided. Their true intentions, their actual fighting capabilities, their knowledge of what lies beyond our borders. He looked to Oscar. I'll invite their captain to share our fire tonight. Men reveal much over food and drink. And if we decide against their offer, asked Carl. Torben's expression hardened. Then they leave at first light, regardless of the weather. We cannot afford additional mouths to feed if they bring nothing of value in return. As the council dispersed to their duties, the snow continued to fall, growing heavier with each passing hour. By nightfall, Ravenshold was transformed into a world of white and shadow, the buildings mere dark shapes against the growing drifts. In the east, beyond the fields now hidden under snow, the campfires of Aldrich and his men burned like fallen stars, their future in the settlement, and perhaps the settlement's future itself, yet to be determined. The fire in Torben's dwelling cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the wind howled, driving snow against the shuttered windows with a sound like distant whispers. Inside, warmth and the aroma of stewed venison created an atmosphere that loosened tongues and lowered guards, precisely as Torben had intended. Aldrich sat across the fire, a wooden cup of mulled cider cradled in his scarred hands. Beside him sat his lieutenant, a quiet, watchful man named Doran. Elsa completed their small circle, her sharp eyes missing nothing as the men talked. Your settlement is well organized, Aldrich observed, taking a careful sip of his drink. Better than most we've encountered in the borderlands. Most huddle behind walls, suspicious of their own shadows. Suspicion keeps one alive, Torben replied, but paranoia kills as surely as carelessness. Ravenshold has learned to balance vigilance with cooperation. How long have you been here? Asked Doran, speaking for the first time that evening. His voice was surprisingly soft for a man of his size. The settlement was established nearly 60 years ago when the kingdom first began its slow retreat, Torben explained. I arrived 23 winters past. As what? Aldrich inquired. You're no simple farmer or craftsman. You carry yourself like a man who's spent time in service. Torben exchanged a quick glance with Elsa before answering. I was a ranger in the King's Forest Guard, patrolling the western marches. Until the Crown abandoned those territories, Aldrich surmised. Something like that, Torben said, his tone indicating he'd say no more on the subject. Aldrich nodded, respecting the boundary. We all have our stories of the kingdom's failures. Mine began last spring, when our garrison received orders to withdraw to Eastkeep. We were to abandon the settlements we'd protected for years. People we'd come to know, children we'd watched grow. But you didn't withdraw, Elsa stated. A shadow crossed Aldrich's face. We started to. Then we encountered refugees streaming west, families fleeing from something that had destroyed their villages. They spoke of pale riders, of slaughter in the night, of children taken. He stared into his cup. We sent a messenger to Eastkeep, requesting permission to investigate. The response was a formal notice disbanding our unit and recalling all loyal soldiers to the capital. So you disobeyed, Torben said. It wasn't a question. We followed the tracks east instead, Aldrich confirmed. What we found, he trailed off, his knuckles whitening around his cup. The Nordmen, Elsa prompted. Not like any raids we'd seen before, Doran interjected, his quiet voice now edged with controlled anger. Not just taking food or valuables, they'd salted fields, poisoned wells. They weren't just raiding, they were making the land uninhabitable. Systematic destruction, Torben murmured, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Aldrich nodded grimly. We tracked them, harried their flanks when possible, rescued who we could. Lost good men doing it. Eventually, we realized we were fighting a losing battle. The Nordmen had numbers, organization, and a plan we couldn't fathom. So we turned west, warning settlements as we went. And offering your services, Elsa added. We're soldiers, Aldrich said simply. Fighting is what we know, and these borderlands need defenders now more than ever. Torben leaned forward. Tell me about this ice wolf who leads them. Something like fear flickered across Aldrich's features before he mastered it. Stories vary. Some say he's a shaman king from beyond the far wastes. Others claim he's a former kingdom general who went native after being left for dead in Nordman territory. What do you believe? Pressed Torben. I believe he understands warfare in ways the Nordmen traditionally haven't, Aldrich replied carefully. Their raids were always brutal but predictable, smash and grab operations. Now they employ tactics, feints, flanking maneuvers, siegecraft. Someone has taught them the art of war as practiced in the civilized lands. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent howl of the wind. You still haven't told us your price, Elsa said finally. For your protection. Aldrich straightened. Food and shelter for the winter. A fair share, no more. Come spring, we discuss more permanent arrangements or we move on. Your choice. And if we face no threats? Torben asked. If the winter passes peacefully? Then you've overpaid for insurance, Aldrich said with a thin smile. But tell me honestly, do you expect peace in these borderlands anymore? Before Torben could respond, a pounding came at the door. Elsa rose smoothly, her hand dropping to the knife at her belt. and opened it to reveal a snow-covered figure, one of the settlement's young watchmen. "Ranger Torben," the youth gasped. "Oscar sends word. 2 of our hunters have returned from the western forest. They bring strange news and a survivor. A girl, half frozen, speaking in tongues no one recognizes." Torben was on his feet immediately. "Where?" "The healing house. The woman tends to her now." Torben looked at Aldrich. "It seems our discussion must continue later." Aldrich stood as well. "Allow us to accompany you. If this girl comes from territories we've traveled to, we might recognize her dialect." After a moment's consideration, Torben nodded. The 4 of them donned their cloaks and stepped out into the raging snowstorm, leaning into the wind as they made their way toward the settlement's modest healing house. Inside, they found Oscar and several council members gathered around a pallet where a small figure lay bundled in furs. Agatha, the settlement's healer, worked methodically, applying salves to frostbitten extremities while murmuring soothing words that seemed to have little effect on the girl's wide-eyed terror. The child couldn't have been more than 12 winters old. Her dark hair was matted and frozen in places, her skin pale except for the angry red of cold burn on her cheeks and nose. But it was her eyes that caught Torben's attention, black as midnight and filled with a horror that seemed too vast for one so young. "She was found stumbling through the western forest," Oscar explained in low tones. "Halvor and Niles were returning from their hunt when they spotted her. No tracks leading to her location. The snow had covered them. No sign of others." "Has she spoken?" Torben asked. "Nothing intelligible," Agatha replied without looking up from her work. "She cries out in her sleep in a language I've not heard before." Aldrich moved closer, studying the girl with a furrowed brow. "May I?" he asked Agatha, gesturing toward the child. The healer hesitated, then nodded. Aldrich knelt beside the pallet and spoke softly in a harsh, guttural tongue. The girl's eyes snapped to his face, and she responded with a torrent of frantic words. "She speaks the northern dialect," Aldrich said, surprise evident in his voice. "She's telling me, she's warning us to run, to hide." He continued the exchange, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "What is she saying?" Elsa demanded when the girl finally fell silent, exhaustion overtaking her. Aldrich rose slowly, his face grave. "She says her village was destroyed 3 days ago, not by Nordmen, but by the dead who walk through winter. She claims ice-pale figures came in the night, moving silently through the snow, killing some and taking others." He met Torben's gaze. "She says they follow the frozen rivers south, and that they hunger for the warmth of the living." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the girl's labored breathing and the howling of the wind outside. "The ravings of a traumatized child," Carl muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Torben said. "Or perhaps there are threats in these borderlands that we've yet to encounter." He turned to the hunters who had found the girl. "Did you see anything unusual on your return journey? Any signs of pursuit or strange tracks?" The men exchanged uneasy glances. "The storm had covered most tracks," said Halvor, the elder of the 2. "But there was a moment, just as dusk was falling, I thought I glimpsed movement on the ridge above the frozen river. Something pale, moving against the snow. I assumed it was a snow fox." "Or your eyes playing tricks," added Niles. "The light grows strange near sunset in snowstorms." "Double the watch tonight," Torben ordered, "and ensure the gates are secured with the reinforced bars." He looked to Aldrich. "It seems your offer of protection may be tested sooner than expected." Aldrich nodded grimly. "My men stand ready." As they dispersed to their duties, Torben lingered, watching the sleeping girl. The borderlands had always been dangerous, a realm where the order of the Old Kingdom gave way to the chaos of the wilderness. But the child's warnings hinted at something beyond the usual threats of cold, hunger, and human predators. Outside, the storm intensified, driving snow against the walls with renewed fury. Within those walls, the people of Ravenshold prepared for a night of watchful waiting, wondering what horrors might be approaching through the blinding white of the winter's first great blizzard. 3 days after the arrival of the mysterious girl, the storm finally broke. Dawn revealed a transformed landscape. Ravenshold stood like an island in a sea of white, snowdrifts piled higher than a man's head against the northern wall. The sky cleared to a crystalline blue, and the sun reflected blindingly off the unbroken expanse of snow. The sudden brightness did little to lift the mood within the settlement. Despite reinforced watches and heightened vigilance, no threat had materialized from the storm. No pale figures emerged from the blizzard. No attack shattered the tense quiet. Yet the absence of danger brought its own kind of strain. Fear of the unknown was wearing on nerves already frayed by the knowledge of limited supplies and the looming hardships of winter. In the council hall, Torben stood before a crude map of the surrounding territories, sketched on a piece of cured hide, and weighted at the corners with river stones. Beside him, Aldrich traced potential routes with a weathered finger. "The main pass will be impassable now," the former captain said, indicating the northern mountain trail. "The snow would be chest deep in the higher elevations." "The Nordmen know other ways," Torben countered. "Hunting tracks, game trails. Their scouts could still move through the high country, even in winter." "At great risk and slow pace," Aldrich agreed. "But you're right, they won't be completely blocked." Oscar joined them, his breath fogging in the chill air of the hall. Despite the central fire pit, the vast room retained a sharp cold that penetrated clothing and settled in bones. "The council is divided," the steward reported. "Some believe we should accept Aldrich's offer of protection. Others distrust armed strangers, regardless of their stories." "And the girl?" Torben asked. "Has she shared any more about what she witnessed?" Oscar shook his head. "She's been in and out of fever since yestereve. Agatha says the cold took a deeper toll than we realized. There's infection in her lungs." Torben nodded grimly. Winter sickness was a familiar killer in the borderlands. Even the young and strong could succumb if the cold had settled too deeply in their chest. "What of the grain count?" he asked, changing the subject. "Worse than we feared," Oscar admitted. "With the addition of Aldrich's men, even on half rations, we'll run out before the first thaw." Aldrich frowned. "You didn't mention this shortage before." "Would you have shared such weakness with armed strangers at your gate?" Elsa asked, entering the hall in time to hear his comment. She stomped snow from her boots and approached the map table. "Fair point," Aldrich conceded. "But it changes matters. My men and I won't be the cause of children starving." "There may be another option," Elsa said, pointing to a location on the map marked with a small circle. "The old monastery at Kestrel's Crag." Torben's eyes narrowed. "It was abandoned years ago." "Yes, but the monks maintained extensive root cellars and granaries," Elsa explained. "When the fever took most of their order 5 winters past, the survivors retreated to the main abbey in the lowlands. They may have left supplies behind, or others may have claimed them since," Oscar cautioned. "It's worth investigating," Torben decided. "A small party could make the journey in 2 days if the weather holds." "I'll go," Aldrich offered. "2 of my men with me, and whoever you choose to represent Ravenshold's interests." Torben nodded. "I'll accompany you myself." "As will I," Elsa added in a tone that brooked no argument. As they discussed details of the expedition, Carl burst into the hall, his breath coming in great white clouds. "Riders approaching from the east," he announced. "Not Nordmen, they fly the banner of Eastkeep." surprise rippled through the room. Eastkeep was the nearest outpost still officially maintained by the kingdom, but it lay a week's hard ride away under the best conditions. How many? Torben demanded. A small company, perhaps 15 men. They're struggling through the snow, 2 sleds with them. Aldrich's face darkened. Kingdom forces this far into the borderlands in winter? Something's wrong. Or they've come to reclaim deserters, Oscar suggested, giving Aldrich a pointed look. Either way, we should greet them properly, Torben decided. Carl, assemble the militia. A show of organized strength often prevents misunderstandings. Oscar, prepare the small hall for guests. Aldrich, my men and I will remain out of sight until you determine their purpose, the captain said grimly. I've no desire to hang for following my conscience. As they dispersed to their tasks, Elsa caught Torben's arm. I mislike this timing, she murmured. Kingdom forces appearing just after we receive warnings of unknown threats? It stretches coincidence. Perhaps they bring news rather than seeking it, Torben replied, though his expression remained troubled. But keep your bow close, just the same. The eastern gate of Ravenshold opened to reveal a bedraggled column of soldiers pushing through snow that reached their thighs in places. Their once proud uniforms were travel-stained and patched, their faces gaunt beneath the kingdom's distinctive helms. At their head rode an officer, whose insignia marked him as a commander, though his fine cloak was now tattered at the edges. Torben and the militia waited in formation, a disciplined display that caused the approaching officer to raise an appreciative eyebrow. Well met, the commander called as he reined in his horse before the gate. I am Commander Thorn of the Eastern Legion, under orders from Eastkeep. We seek shelter from the winter and would share news of grave importance. Ravenshold offers hospitality to those who come in peace, Torben replied formally. I am Torben Wolfson, Ranger of the Council. What brings Kingdom forces so deep into the borderlands in winter's grip? Thorn's weathered face grew grim. Necessity and warning, Ranger. The borderlands have become more dangerous than ever before. We ride to alert the scattered settlements of new threats gathering in the north, and to offer evacuation to those willing to retreat to Kingdom protection. Murmurs ran through the assembled militia at these words. Evacuation was unprecedented. For the Kingdom to extend such an offer suggested dangers far beyond the usual winter hardships. Your men look tired and cold, Torben observed. Come inside, warm yourselves, and we can speak of these matters in comfort. As the Kingdom soldiers filed through the gate, Elsa moved to Torben's side. Evacuation, she whispered. After decades of abandonment, now they offer rescue? What could frighten the Kingdom so? Perhaps the same thing that frightened a young girl into fleeing through a blizzard, Torben replied softly. We'll know soon enough. In the small hall, with a roaring fire dispelling the worst of the chill, Commander Thorn accepted a mug of hot cider with gratitude. His second-in-command, a hard-faced woman introduced as Lieutenant Sarah, remained standing despite the offered seat, her eyes constantly scanning the room in the manner of someone who expected threats from any quarter. We've encountered 3 settlements already on our journey, Thorn explained once the council had assembled, or what remained of them. Explain, Oscar prompted when the commander paused. Destroyed, burned to the ground, but not in the usual way of raids. Thorn's eyes held a haunted look. There were no bodies, counselor, not one. Every man, woman, and child gone, and the ruins were strange, frozen solid despite evidence of fire, as if the very stones had been subjected to an impossible cold. A heavy silence fell over the hall. When did these attacks occur? Torben asked finally. The first we discovered was Frostmere, 12 days ago, Thorn replied. Then Widow's Keep and Tanner's Ford, each progressively closer to your settlement. And you believe we're next, Carl stated flatly. I believe nowhere in the borderlands is safe anymore, Thorn corrected. That's why we offer evacuation to Eastkeep. The fortress can shelter additional civilians through winter until safe passage to the interior becomes possible in spring. At what cost? Elsa asked sharply. The kingdom abandoned these territories years ago. Why the sudden concern for borderland folk? Lieutenant Sarah stiffened at her tone, but Thorn raised a placating hand. A fair question, my lady. The truth is, these new threats concern the kingdom directly. What begins in the borderlands will not stay contained here. Self-interest and moral duty align for once. You speak of threats, but you've not named them, Torben pointed out. What exactly destroyed these settlements? Thorn exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his lieutenant. Reports vary. Survivors are few and often damaged in mind by what they witnessed. Some speak of pale raiders who feel no pain and cannot be killed by normal means. Others describe creatures of living ice or spirits of winter given flesh. Folk tales spawned by fear, Carl scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. Perhaps, Thorn allowed. But something very real left very real destruction in its wake, and it moves south, following the frozen rivers. The same path the girl had mentioned, Torben noted silently. How many can you evacuate? Oscar asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Our sleds can carry the children and infirm. Adults would need to walk, but we've brought additional supplies for the journey. Thorn leaned forward earnestly. I won't pretend it would be easy. The trek to Eastkeep would take 10 days in these conditions, but we can make it. And those who choose to remain? Elsa asked. A shadow crossed Thorn's face. We cannot force evacuation, but I strongly advise against staying. Whatever approaches. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. The Legion will depart in 2 days, with or without you. I urge your council to decide quickly. As the discussion continued, Torben slipped away, making his way to the small hut where Aldrich and his men had concealed themselves. He found the former captain watching through a narrow gap in the shutters, his expression troubled. You heard? Torben asked. Enough, Aldrich confirmed. Thorn's reputation is solid. He's not one for exaggeration or undue panic. You know him? By reputation only. He's a career Legion, dedicated to duty. Aldrich turned from the window. If he's offering evacuation, the threat must be dire indeed. Yet you seem skeptical, Torben observed. Not of the threat, Aldrich clarified. Of the solution. Eastkeep is a formidable fortress, but it was built to withstand human attackers. If something truly otherworldly approaches, he shook his head. Stone walls may not be enough. What would you suggest? Mobility, preparation, knowledge. Aldrich's scarred face was grim. If these attacks follow the frozen rivers, perhaps the answer lies not in flight or fortification, but in understanding the nature of the enemy. Torben nodded slowly. The monastery expedition becomes even more important now. If we can secure those supplies, we gain options, whether to evacuate or to stand our ground. Agreed. We should leave at first light tomorrow. Aldrich hesitated. But Torben, if Thorn recognizes me or my men, he'll be duty-bound to arrest us as deserters. His offer of evacuation wouldn't extend to us. Then we'll need to ensure the expedition departs quietly, Torben replied, and returns with answers, not just grain. As he left Aldrich's hiding place, Torben gazed up at the clear, cold sky. Stars glittered like ice crystals in the black expanse, beautiful and merciless. In the borderlands, even the heavens offered no comfort, only cold light by which to glimpse approaching doom. The decisions made in the next 2 days would determine not just who would survive the winter, but whether anyone would survive at all. Dawn broke clear and bitterly cold, the air so crisp it seemed it might shatter with each breath. Torben, Elsa, Aldrich, and 2 of his men, The scout Rorik and the taciturn swordsman Doran gathered at the eastern postern gate, a small, rarely used exit concealed behind the grain stores. Their departure required secrecy. Commander Thorn's presence complicated matters considerably. "The snow has crusted overnight," Torben observed, testing the surface with his boot. "We can move atop it rather than wading through. It'll speed our journey." Elsa adjusted the pack on her shoulders, its contents carefully chosen for maximum utility with minimum weight. Flint and tinder wrapped in waxed cloth, dried meat and hard journey bread, a small cookpot, bandages, and various herbs for both medicine and flavoring their meals. Across her back, her bow and quiver completed her equipment. "Kestrel's Crag lies 15 leagues northeast," she said, pointing toward the distant hills, barely visible in the dawnlight. "If we maintain a steady pace, we can reach it by nightfall tomorrow. Assuming we encounter no obstacles," Aldrich added grimly. He wore no insignia now, nothing to mark him as a former kingdom officer. His men likewise had discarded any identifying gear, appearing as simple borderland travelers. Dangerous ones, to be sure, but not obviously military. "The path follows the old logging road for the first 10 leagues, Torben explained. "After that, we cross the frozen river and climb through Harrow's Pass. The monastery sits on the cliff above." "Exposed position," noted Rorik, speaking for the first time. The scout's weathered face was nearly hidden in the shadow of his hood. "Good for defense against conventional attackers, less so against winter itself." "The brothers chose the site for its isolation," Elsa explained. "Their order valued contemplation above comfort. Let's hope they value preparedness as well," Doran muttered, and left something of use behind. With a final check of their gear, the small party slipped out through the postern gate and into the vast white expanse beyond Ravenshold's walls. They moved in single file, Torben breaking trail, each carefully placing their feet in the impressions left by the person ahead to minimize their tracks. The rising sun at their backs cast long blue shadows across the unmarked snow. Their pace was good through the morning. The crusted snow supported their weight, and the clear sky allowed them to navigate with confidence. By midday, they had covered nearly 5 leagues, the settlement now lost to sight behind them, the wooded foothills of the northeastern range growing steadily larger ahead. They paused briefly to eat, huddled in the shelter of a massive fallen oak that protruded from the snow like the skeleton of some enormous beast. No fire was risked. Cold journey bread and strips of dried venison would sustain them until evening. "The girl," Aldrich said as they ate, "the one who spoke of the Pale Walkers. Has she improved?" Elsa shook her head. "The fever worsened before we left. Agatha was preparing a stronger decoction of willow bark and echinacea, but—" She left the thought unfinished. They all knew winter sickness often claimed even the strongest. "What else did she tell you?" Torben asked. "Before the fever took hold." Aldrich chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Little that made sense. She spoke of her village, Stonebrook, a small mining settlement 3 days' journey north of here. Said the attacks came during the new moon, when the night was at its darkest." He paused. "She described the attackers as those who had gone before. The dead returned." "Folk superstition," Doran said dismissively. "Fear transforms bandits into monsters." "Perhaps," Aldrich allowed. "But Commander Thorn is no superstitious peasant. If something destroyed 3 settlements and left no bodies—" "We focus on our task," Torben interrupted firmly. "Secure supplies first, solve mysteries second." They resumed their journey as the afternoon wore on, entering the sparse woodland that marked the beginning of the northeastern foothills. Here the snow lay less evenly, wind sculpted into drifts around the bases of trees, and bare in patches where overhanging branches had sheltered the ground. The old logging road was barely discernible, little more than a slightly wider space between the trees. But Torben followed it with the confidence of one who had traveled this way many times before. As the light began to fade, he led them to a small clearing, where the remains of an old woodcutter's hut provided some shelter from the wind. "We'll rest here for the night," he decided. "The walls still stand enough to break the wind, and we can risk a small fire in the old hearth." The hut was little more than 3 crumbling stone walls, and the remnants of a chimney, its wooden roof long since collapsed and rotted away. But after clearing snow from the interior and gathering deadfall from the surrounding forest, they soon had a modest fire burning in the ancient hearth, its light creating an island of warmth in the gathering darkness. "I'll take the first watch," Rorik volunteered, moving to position himself near the gap that had once been the hut's doorway. "Wake me for a second," Elsa said, arranging her cloak to serve as both blanket and bedroll near the fire. As the others settled in to rest, Torben joined Rorik at the entrance, gazing out at the star-filled sky above the dark trees. "You were a scout in the Eastern March," Torben said quietly. "Not a question," Rorik nodded. 15 years. Before that, I ranged with the forest wardens in the Southern Territories." "You've seen much of the borderlands, then?" "More than most." Rorik's voice remained neutral, but Torben sensed a wariness beneath his words. "In your ranging," Torben asked carefully, "have you ever encountered anything like what the girl described? Or what destroyed those settlements?" Rorik was silent for so long that Torben thought he might not answer. Finally, the scout spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 winters ago, I was tracking a group of bandits through the far northern reaches. They'd raided an outpost, taken supplies and hostages. I followed them into a valley I'd never mapped before, a place where the trees grew strange, and the snow seemed darker somehow, as if shadow had been mixed into its substance. Torben remained silent, waiting. "I found the bandits 2 days later," Rorik continued, "or what remained of them. Their camp had been devastated, bodies frozen solid, but not by natural cold. Some were shattered like statues of ice someone had struck with a hammer." He drew a deep breath. "The hostages were gone, no tracks leading away, no signs of what had attacked. Just an unnatural silence and cold that seemed to sink into my very bones." "Did you report this?" A bitter smile touched Rorik's lips. "To whom?" The kingdom was already withdrawing its presence. Outposts were being abandoned. Reports of strange occurrences were dismissed as the ravings of border-mad scouts. He shook his head. "I marked the valley on my personal maps as forbidden ground and never returned." "Could what you saw then be related to what's happening now?" "I don't know," Rorik admitted, "but I've been a scout long enough to recognize patterns. The kingdom doesn't send evacuation parties for simple bandit activity or even Nordman raids. Something has frightened them badly, something they don't fully understand, but know they cannot fight." With that disquieting thought, Rorik turned his attention back to the darkness beyond their small sanctuary, and Torben returned to the fire, his mind troubled by possibilities too terrible to voice aloud. The night passed without incident, each taking their turn at watch. Dawn found them already on the move, eating their cold breakfast as they walked to make up time. The second day's journey proved more challenging as they began to ascend into the hills. The old logging road eventually disappeared entirely, forcing them to navigate by Torben's memory and Rorik's woodcraft. By midday, they reached the frozen river, a snaking ribbon of white cutting through the forested valley below them. Unlike the streams near Ravenshold, this river had frozen solid, its surface smooth and gray-white, unmarked by cracks or air bubbles. "That's not natural," Elsa observed as they carefully made their way down the slope toward the crossing point. Rivers this size don't freeze completely, not even in the deepest winter. The monastery draws its water from an underground spring, Torben recalled. The brothers never relied on the river. They considered its waters tainted. Tainted how? Aldrich asked sharply. Torben shrugged. Old superstitions. They said the river flowed from a place of ancient power, deep in the mountains, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. More cheerful borderland folklore, Doran muttered, but his hand rested uneasily on his sword hilt as they approached the river's edge. The crossing was quick but tense, each of them spreading out to distribute their weight on the ice, moving with careful, deliberate steps. Though the surface appeared solid, the unnatural smoothness made footing treacherous. When they reached the far bank, even Doran seemed relieved to be back on solid ground. Harrow's Pass lies ahead, Torben said, pointing to a narrow defile between two steep, rocky slopes. Once through, we'll have a direct climb to Kestrel's Crag. The pass proved narrower than it had appeared from a distance, forcing them to proceed in single file between towering walls of stone and ice. The sun couldn't penetrate the depths of the crevasse, leaving them to walk in a twilight gloom despite the midday hour. "I mislike this place," Doran said quietly, his voice echoing slightly off the icy walls. "Perfect spot for an ambush." "The pass is rarely used," Torben assured him. "Even in summer, traders prefer the longer route through the lowlands." "That's not what concerns me," the swordsman replied, but elaborated no further. They were nearing the end of the pass, the path beginning to slope upward toward daylight, when Rorik suddenly raised his hand for halt. The scout dropped to one knee, examining something on the ground that the others couldn't see from their positions. "Tracks," he announced, his voice tight with tension. "Recently, made since the last snowfall." The others moved forward cautiously to look. There in the thin layer of snow covering the rocky ground were footprints, or something like footprints. They resembled the impressions a human foot might make, but were oddly shaped as if the person had been walking with an unnatural gait, the weight distributed wrong. "How many?" Aldrich asked, hand moving to his sword. "Hard to say," Rorik replied. "The impressions overlap. Several, moving in both directions, some within the last day." "What manner of boot makes such a print?" Elsa wondered, kneeling for a closer look. "Not a boot," Rorik said grimly. "These were made by bare feet." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through the group. "No one walks barefoot in this cold," Doran protested. "They'd lose their feet to frostbite within hours." "Unless they were already dead," Aldrich said softly, recalling the girl's words. Torben straightened, making a swift decision. "We continue as planned, but with greater caution. Weapons ready, voices low. We're too far from Ravenshold to turn back now, and we need what the monastery might hold." With newfound wariness, they proceeded through the remainder of the pass and began the steep ascent toward Kestrel's Crag. The climb was arduous, the path switching back and forth across the face of the cliff. In places, they were forced to use their hands as well as their feet, pulling themselves up over rocky outcroppings slick with ice. It was late afternoon when they finally crested the ridge and beheld the monastery of Kestrel's Crag. The structure was impressive even in abandonment, a series of stone buildings clinging to the very edge of the cliff, overlooking the vast expanse of the borderlands below. Built from the same gray stone as the mountain itself, the monastery seemed to grow organically from the rock, its walls and towers rising seamlessly from the cliff face. "The brothers chose well," Aldrich observed, catching his breath after the climb. "Defensible, with commanding views in all directions." "They weren't primarily concerned with defense," Elsa corrected. "This order believed in positioning themselves between earth and sky, as mediators between the mortal and divine realms. Philosophy aside, Doran interjected practically, does the place appear occupied? They studied the monastery carefully. No smoke rose from any of the chimneys. No movement could be detected along the walls or in the central courtyard visible through the open main gate. Snow lay undisturbed across most of the grounds, save for a single set of tracks leading from the gate to the main building. The same strange footprints they had observed in the past. Someone, or something is here, Rorik confirmed, his voice low. Or was recently, Torben amended. We approach with caution. Rorik, circle left and find a vantage point covering the main building. Doran, secure the gate once we're inside. Elsa, Aldrich, and I will investigate the storage areas. With weapons drawn, they moved silently toward the monastery. The main gate stood partially open, frozen in position by ice that had formed around its massive hinges. They slipped through the gap one by one, eyes scanning constantly for movement or threat. The courtyard beyond was a study in desolation. What had once been a garden was now an expanse of snow-covered earth, the skeletal remains of herbs and vegetables protruding like bones. A frozen fountain stood at the center, its basin filled with ice that had formed in layers, creating a bizarre sculpture of suspended motion. Rorik split off as planned, moving along the perimeter wall toward a bell tower that would provide an elevated position. Doran took up position by the gate, ensuring nothing could enter or leave without his awareness. Torben led Elsa and Aldrich toward the eastern wing of the complex, where the monastery's storerooms and root cellars would be located. They moved from shadow to shadow, alert for any sound that might betray another presence. But the monastery remained eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of timber contracting in the cold and the distant keening of wind across the cliff face. The door to the storage wing stood ajar, its iron hinges rimed with frost. Beyond lay darkness. Torben unshuttered a small lantern he carried, its flame casting long shadows as they entered the building. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air still and heavy with the scent of dust and abandonment. Stone floors echoed slightly under their cautious footsteps as they moved deeper into the structure, passing empty rooms that had once served as workshops or living quarters for the lay brothers who had managed the monastery's practical affairs. The main storerooms would be below, Elsa whispered, indicating a narrow stairway leading downward. The brothers maintained extensive cellars for preserving food through winter. The stairs descended into absolute darkness that their small lantern barely penetrated. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands blocked further progress. Unlike the other doors they had encountered, this one was securely closed, with no signs of forced entry. A good sign, Aldrich murmured. If the stores were looted, this door would likely have been broken open. Torben handed the lantern to Elsa and examined the door more closely. No lock, just a simple bar mechanism. He grasped the iron handle and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protest, the door swung outward, releasing a blast of cold air that made their lantern flame dance wildly. Beyond the door stretched a long corridor lined with smaller doors on either side, the monastery's famed storage cellars. But something was wrong. The corridor floor was covered in a thin layer of ice, smooth and clear as glass, reflecting their lantern light in disorienting patterns. This isn't natural, Elsa said, her voice barely audible. Even in the deepest cellars, water doesn't freeze like this without... Without what? Aldrich prompted when she didn't continue. Without purpose, she finished, her expression troubled. They moved forward cautiously, testing each step on the slick surface. The first door on the right hung partially open. Torben pushed it wider with his sword tip, revealing a chamber that had once held grain. Now, only empty barrels remained, their lids shattered, as if something had burst upward from within them. The next room told a similar tale. Shelves that should have held preserved fruits and vegetables now stood empty, with broken jars scattered across the icy floor. Room after room revealed the same scene of disruption and emptiness. Someone reached the stores before us, Aldrich concluded grimly. Recently, by the look of it. Not someone, Elsa countered, kneeling to examine a strange pattern in the ice coating the floor. These are the same footprints we saw outside, bare feet, walking with an unnatural gait. The dead who walk through winter, Torben quoted softly, recalling the girl's warning. A sudden crash from above made them all freeze in place. It was followed by a high-pitched whistling sound, Rorik's warning signal. "We're not alone," Aldrich said, drawing his sword in a fluid motion. They hurried back toward the stairs, abandoning stealth for speed. As they emerged into the upper level, a figure lunged from the shadows. Doran, his face pale with urgency. "We need to leave," the swordsman hissed. "Now." "What did you see?" Torben demanded. "Not what. Who?" Doran replied. Rorik spotted movement on the north side of the complex, figures approaching from the direction of the frozen river, at least a dozen. They move wrong. "The stores are empty anyway," Aldrich said. "We take what we can carry and go." "There's another way out," Elsa interjected. The brothers maintained an escape tunnel in case the monastery was attacked. It exits halfway down the cliff face on the southern side. "You're certain it still exists?" Torben asked. "As certain as one can be about a secret tunnel in an abandoned monastery," she replied with grim humor. "The entrance should be in the abbot's chambers in the main building." "Then we move there immediately," Torben decided. "Doran, find Rorik and tell him to meet us at the main building. Use the shadows. Stay out of sight." As Doran slipped away to carry the message, the remaining three made their way across the courtyard toward the central structure of the monastery complex. Unlike the utilitarian storage wing, this building featured elaborate stonework and tall, narrow windows. Most now be broken, their empty frames like eye sockets in a skull. They entered through the main doors, which stood partially collapsed inward, as if something had forced its way in with great violence. Inside, what had once been a grand entrance hall lay in ruins. Fallen timbers from the partial collapse of the roof created an obstacle course of debris. Snow had drifted in through the broken windows and holes in the ceiling, covering the stone floor in patches of white. The abbot's chambers would be on the upper level, Elsa said, pointing to a staircase that miraculously remained intact at the far end of the hall. They picked their way through the wreckage, moving as quietly as possible despite the occasional crunch of frozen debris underfoot. The staircase creaked ominously as they ascended, but held their weight. The upper corridor was in better condition, protected from the worst of the elements by the remaining sections of roof. Doors lined both sides, leading to what had once been the private cells of the senior brothers. At the end of the hallway stood a larger door, reinforced with decorative iron bands fashioned in the shape of intertwined vines, the abbot's chambers. This door, unlike so many others in the monastery, was intact and firmly closed. Torben tried the handle and found it locked. "Stand back," Aldrich whispered, drawing a heavy dagger from his belt. With practiced skill, he inserted the blade into the gap near the lock mechanism and applied careful pressure. After a tense moment, something clicked and the door swung inward. The abbot's chamber was surprisingly well preserved. A large bed with rotting hangings dominated one wall. Bookshelves, mostly empty, but with a few moldering tomes still in place, lined another. A desk and chair stood near the room's single window, which remained intact, though thick frost obscured the view beyond. The tunnel entrance should be concealed somewhere, Elsa said, already moving around the room, tapping walls and examining the floor for signs of a hidden passage. Aldrich joined the search, checking behind the remaining tapestries and running his hands along the edges of the stone walls. Torben moved to the window, using his dagger to scrape away enough frost to peer outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Across the courtyard, moving with unnatural grace despite their shambling gait, came a procession of figures. They were humanoid in form, but wrong in every detail. Their skin was the pale blue-white of deep ice, and their movements suggested limbs that bent in ways human joints should not allow. Most disturbing of all were their eyes. Not eyes at all, but empty sockets filled with a cold blue light that cast eerie illumination across their frozen features. "They're here," Torben said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "At least 20 of them crossing the courtyard." "The tunnel quickly," Elsa urged, her search becoming more frantic. "Here," Aldrich called from beside the massive bed. He had pushed the heavy frame aside, revealing a section of flooring that didn't match the rest. A small iron ring lay flush with the stone, nearly invisible unless one knew to look for it. Together, Torben and Aldrich pulled on the ring, lifting a trapdoor that revealed a dark shaft with iron rungs embedded in the wall, descending into blackness. "I'll go first," Elsa said, already swinging her legs into the opening. "Follow quickly." As she disappeared into the darkness, the sound of splintering wood echoed from the corridor outside. The creatures had entered the building. "Go," Torben urged Aldrich. "I'll hold them off until Rorik and Doran arrive." "If they arrive," Aldrich said grimly, but he moved to the trapdoor and began his descent. Torben took position near the door, sword ready. He could hear the creatures moving through the corridor now, a strange shuffling punctuated by cracking sounds, as if their frozen limbs protested their movement. The door to the abbot's chamber crashed inward. Torben found himself face to face with one of the ice-pale figures. Up close, its wrongness was even more apparent. What had once been a human face was now a mask of frozen flesh, features contorted in a rictus between agony and ecstasy. The blue light emanating from its eye sockets cast Torben's shadow long across the room. Without hesitation, Torben struck, his sword biting deep into the creature's shoulder. But instead of blood, the wound expelled a blast of frigid air, like opening a door to the deepest winter night. The creature showed no pain, no reaction beyond a slight pause in its advance. Then, with frightening speed, it lunged forward. Torben barely avoided its grasp, stumbling backward toward the window. Two more creatures entered the room, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of a single controlling intelligence rather than individual wills. A whistle from the corridor announced Rorik's arrival. The scout appeared in the doorway, firing a crossbow bolt that took one of the creatures directly in what would have been its heart. The bolt sank deep, but like Torben's sword strike, seemed to cause no distress. The creature simply turned its attention to this new threat. "The tunnel!" Torben shouted. "Now!" Rorik backed toward the trapdoor, reloading his crossbow as he moved. "Doran is lost," he reported tersely. They surrounded him near the bell tower. Torben felt a stab of grief, but pushed it aside. There would be time for mourning later, if they survived. "Go, I'm right behind you," he ordered, slashing at another advancing creature to gain some space. Rorik disappeared into the tunnel. Torben prepared to follow, but as he backed toward the opening, his foot encountered something soft and yielding, a rotted section of flooring. With a sickening crack, the wood gave way beneath him, and he found himself falling, tumbling through splintered timber into darkness. Pain greeted Torben's return to consciousness, a sharp, insistent throbbing in his left leg that suggested something was broken or badly sprained. He lay amid debris in near total darkness, the only light a faint glow filtering down through the hole he had fallen through in the ceiling above. Slowly, carefully, he took stock of his situation. He had landed in what appeared to be a small chapel or meditation room, one floor below the abbot's chambers. His sword lay several feet away, having fallen with him. His pack remained on his back, though the impact had crushed some of its contents. Most concerningly, he could hear no sounds of pursuit from above, but neither could he hear his companions in the tunnel. He had been left behind. Grimacing against the pain, Torben pulled himself to a sitting position and examined his injured leg. Not broken, he determined with relief, but badly twisted at the ankle. He could walk but not run, and climbing would be excruciating. The blue glow from above suddenly intensified. Looking up, Torben saw one of the ice-pale creatures peering down through the hole, its empty eye sockets fixed upon him. A moment later, it disappeared from view. They knew where he was, and they were coming. Torben dragged himself toward his sword, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his leg. He reached the weapon just as he heard sounds from the corridor outside the chapel, the now familiar shuffling gait of the creatures, drawing nearer. With the wall at his back and his sword in hand, Torben prepared himself for what might be his final stand. But as the shuffling grew louder, another sound caught his attention. A faint scraping from behind a tapestry to his right, depicting the monastery's patron saint in faded threads. The tapestry moved, pushed aside to reveal a narrow opening in the wall behind it. Elsa's face appeared in the gap, her expression shifting from determination to relief when she saw him. "Quickly," she whispered urgently. "They're all through the building now." Torben pulled himself toward the opening, dragging his injured leg behind him. Elsa reached out to help, pulling him through the narrow gap just as the chapel door burst open, admitting 3 of the frozen creatures. The passage beyond was cramped and pitch dark. Elsa pulled the tapestry back into place and led Torben deeper into the darkness, supporting him as he limped along. "Secondary tunnel," she explained in hushed tones. The brothers were nothing if not prepared for siege. This one connects to the main escape route further down. "The others?" Torben asked, his voice tight with pain. "Waiting at the junction ahead. Rorik said you fell. We couldn't leave without attempting to find you." They moved as quickly as Torben's injury would allow, feeling their way along rough stone walls. After what seemed an eternity of painful progress, they emerged into a slightly wider tunnel where Aldrich and Rorik waited, tense and watchful. "You're alive?" Aldrich observed with gruff relief. "Can you continue?" "I have little choice," Torben replied grimly. "How far is the exit?" "Half a league of tunnels, according to Elsa," Rorik said. "Then a narrow path down the cliff face to the southern woods." "Those things," Torben said as they resumed their journey, now with Rorik leading and Aldrich supporting Torben's injured side. "What are they?" "The dead who walk through winter," Elsa quoted softly, just as the girl said. "But what does that mean?" Aldrich pressed. "Revenants? Spirits? Some borderland curse we've not encountered before?" "I recognized one of them," Rorik said, his voice hollow with horror. "The third that entered the abbot's chamber. It wore the face of Corrigan, a scout who disappeared from our patrol last autumn. We assumed the Nordmen took him." A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed the implications of this revelation. "They're using our dead against us," Aldrich concluded eventually. "Someone or something is animating the fallen, turning them into these abominations." "Not just animation," Elsa added. "Transformation. The cold within them isn't natural. It's concentrated, directed, a weapon. They continued in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the long, dark tunnel. The air grew gradually colder as they proceeded, suggesting they were moving deeper into the mountain before turning outward toward the cliff face. Eventually, the tunnel began to slope upward, and a faint gray light appeared ahead, the exit. They emerged onto a narrow ledge cut into the southern face of the cliff, halfway between the monastery above and the forest below. The afternoon sun had already disappeared behind the western mountains, leaving the cliff face in deepening shadow. "We can reach the forest before full dark if we hurry," Rorik said, already scanning the precarious path that zigzagged down the cliff. "Wait," Torben said, something nagging at his mind. The stores were empty, but not merely looted. You saw the barrels, burst from within, not broken into from outside. "What are you suggesting?" Aldrich asked. "The brothers who remained here," Torben said slowly, piecing together the horrifying truth. "They didn't leave, they became the first." The monastery was the beginning, Elsa realized, her face paling. Not just a target, the source. But why here? Rorik wondered. What made this place special? "The river," Elsa answered, recalling Torben's earlier words. The brothers believed it flowed from a place where the veil between worlds was thin. They avoided its waters, considering them tainted. Her eyes widened with sudden understanding. They were right. "We need to return to Ravenshold," Aldrich said urgently. "If these creatures follow the frozen rivers south, then our settlement lies directly in their path," Torben finished, "as do all the communities along the watershed." With renewed purpose, despite their fatigue and Torben's injury, they began the treacherous descent. The path was narrow and icy in places, requiring careful foot placement and occasionally the use of hands to maintain balance. Torben's progress was painfully slow, each step on his injured ankle sending spikes of agony up his leg, but he pushed through the pain, knowing that every moment counted. They were halfway down when Rorik, in the lead position, suddenly froze. "Movement in the trees below," the scout whispered, dropping to a crouch that the others mimicked as best they could on the narrow path. Through the gathering gloom, they could make out figures moving among the trees at the base of the cliff, the shuffling gait unmistakable even at this distance. "They've circled around," Aldrich realized, "cutting off our escape route." "How many?" Torben asked. "A dozen at least," Rorik replied after studying the forest edge carefully. "Spread out in a line, as if they knew we would come this way. They're hunting us specifically," Elsa concluded, "not just wandering. That suggests intelligence," Aldrich said grimly. "Purpose. We need another way down," Torben decided, looking along the cliff face in both directions. "The path continues around that outcropping to the west. Where does it lead?" "Eventually back to the river," Elsa answered. "But we'd be moving away from Ravenshold, not toward it." "Better than walking into an ambush," Aldrich pointed out. "We can circle back once we're clear." With no better options, they began moving carefully along the path, hugging the cliff wall as they navigated around the western outcropping. Beyond, the path continued, but narrowed even further, in some places barely wide enough for a single foot. Night was falling rapidly now, the last light fading from the sky, leaving them to move by feel more than sight. The wind had picked up, biting through their cloaks with icy teeth and threatening to pluck them from their precarious position. "There," Rorik said suddenly, pointing ahead. "A cave entrance." Sure enough, a dark opening gaped in the cliff face where the path widened slightly. Without discussion, they made for this potential shelter, reaching it just as the last light disappeared from the sky. The cave extended only about 20 feet into the cliff, but it offered welcome protection from the wind and concealment from searching eyes. After determining it was unoccupied and had no other entrances, they allowed themselves to relax marginally. "We can risk a small fire," Torben suggested. "The entrance faces away from the monastery, and the wind will disperse the smoke." While Elsa tended to Torben's injured ankle, binding it tightly with strips torn from a spare shirt, Aldrich and Rorik gathered what little dry material they could find near the cave entrance and managed to start a tiny, carefully shielded fire. Its warmth was minimal, but the psychological comfort it offered was immeasurable. "We should eat and rest in shifts," Aldrich proposed. "Two sleeping, two on watch." "Agreed," Torben said. "But first we need to plan our next move. The monastery was a failure, no supplies to be had, and now we know of a new threat moving toward Ravenshold." "We need to warn them," Elsa said. "Commander Thorn's evacuation offer looks considerably more attractive now." "If we can reach them in time," Rorik added somberly. "The direct route back is blocked, and circling around will add at least a day to our journey." "There's something else we should consider," Aldrich said, his expression grave in the flickering firelight. "The girl who escaped, the one who warned us, she said these creatures hunger for the warmth of the living. If that's true, Ravenshold represents the largest concentration of warmth in the region. A beacon drawing them in," Torben concluded grimly, "and we left them unprepared for this specific threat." "We don't know if conventional weapons are effective," Rorik pointed out. "My crossbow bolt and your sword seem to cause no damage." "Fire," Elsa suggested. "These creatures embody cold and ice. Perhaps fire is their antithesis." "It's worth trying," Aldrich agreed. "But first, we need to evade those patrolling below and find a safe route back to the settlement." They divided the watch, with Elsa and Rorik taking the first shift, while Torben and Aldrich attempted to rest. Despite his exhaustion and pain, sleep eluded Torben. His mind raced with images of the frozen creatures, of their eerie blue-lit eye sockets, of the recognition Rorik had seen in one's face. "You're not sleeping," Aldrich observed quietly from his position nearby. "No," Torben admitted. "My thoughts are too troubled." "Mine as well," the former captain confessed. "I keep thinking about what these creatures represent, not just as a threat, but as a harbinger." "What do you mean?" Aldrich stared into the tiny fire. "The kingdom withdraws, civilization retreats, and in the vacuum left behind, ancient things reawaken. The borderlands have always been liminal spaces, places where the orderly world gives way to wilderness. Perhaps they're also where our world brushes against others." "You believe these creatures come from beyond our world?" Torben asked, skeptical despite what he had witnessed. "I believe," Aldrich said carefully, "that there are older powers in these lands than the kingdom ever acknowledged. Powers that recede when civilization advances and re-emerge when it withdraws." He looked directly at Torben. "Your people have lived in the borderlands longer than most. Surely you've heard the old stories." Torben remained silent for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "My grandmother told tales of the time before, when winter was not merely a season, but an entity with consciousness and will, when the cold itself sought to reclaim the world from the warmth of human hearths." "And how did our ancestors survive these winters?" Aldrich pressed. "Through unity," Torben replied. "Through fire and fellowship, and rituals of binding that kept the deep cold at bay." He frowned, remembering details of stories he'd dismissed as mere fancy in his youth. "And through sacrifice, in the direst times." "What kind of sacrifice?" "The stories aren't specific," Torben said, though this wasn't entirely true. Some versions had been very specific indeed, but those were tales told only in whispers on the longest nights of winter. Their conversation was interrupted by Rorik's urgent gesture from the cave entrance. Both men moved to join him and Elsa, careful to stay out of sight from below. "Movement on the path we ascended," the scout reported. "They're following our trail up from the forest." In the dim starlight, they could just make out several of the pale figures beginning the climb up the cliff face, their movements unnervingly fluid despite the treacherous terrain.